Vicky Hioureas is the founder of Palaiologue, giving us a modern take on traditional clothing. And Vicky joins me to chat all about it. Hi.
Hi. I just want to start off by thanking you for inviting me on this program. I think it's a really great project, great initiative, and I wish you all kinds of success. And you sure have your work cut out for you, because there are a lot of Greek women in the diaspora who have a lot of interesting projects to talk about.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so honored that you can join me today. So tell me about what inspired you to start Palaiologue. I know you're bringing your two worlds together as a historian, but also as a fashion designer.
Yeah, the fashion designer wasn't exactly my world, but I've been folk dancing since I was 4. The first costume, the first folk dress I ever wore was a Thracian one from Metaxades. And I was in love from then. And growing up, I took sewing classes and things like that in high school, so I knew the basics of how to sew. But I'd always wanted to kind of add a folk flavor because I loved the embroidery. I loved watching women embroider. My own mother would handle the dresses for the folk dance competitions. And when I traveled extensively in Greece too, I learned how to weave on a loom from a few women in a village in Thrace. And so I've always just really just loved this really rich tradition that we have with traditional Greek dress. And I wanted to find a way to incorporate it into what I wear. And so that's kind of how it started.
Yeah. And I love what you're doing. And I love how you're also giving us a chance to connect with our history as well, and essentially keep tradition alive through your designs. So I'd love to know a little bit more about where your love for folk traditions and rural Greece comes from.
So we were lucky to have been raised in California, in Southern California, and we have a really strong connection to folk dance there. We have a really good network of churches, because everything is on the West Coast is done through churches and parishes. And we would go to dance competitions, have folk dance practice every week. And then just growing up, once we were old enough to kind of be autonomous in Greece, my brother too, he's also really into folk traditions, and he plays the Thracian gaida among a few other instruments. So we would travel around together, and we spent a lot of summers, especially in Thrace, because that's just kind of where our passion lies. And that was really the start of it for us. It was from being enrolled in the dance program as children, and then just kind of slowly diving deeper into what these traditions actually were. It wasn't just a dance to be performed at a competition, but it was something that meant something to these communities. It was a way of expression. It was who they were. It was their identity. And then when I would go to these villages with my brother, and I would always spend time with the women naturally, and I would ask them about songs. So I'd record their songs and their stories about what it was like to be in the village, so many years ago, and all this kind of social history questions. I would ask them about how long have these been going on? And of course, the very cliche answer you hear when you ask certain people about folk traditions in Greece, they say, this is from ancient Greece, this is from Dionysus, this is, all this kind of excessive explanations. And so when I was in undergrad, I wanted to study Greek history and kind of learn more about this. And then eventually this just kind of hobby that I had about learning Greek history to see about who we are, it led me to do another degree in Byzantine history. And then I ended up writing about folk traditions in Byzantium. Eventually that led to getting my PhD in Byzantine history. And then, it kind of snowballed from there. But both worlds in that sense, Greek dance and history came together.
Yeah, and I love how it's been a lifelong passion for you as well. But I want to talk a little bit more about the clothing, because I know that each season's collection is inspired by the unique traditional clothing of different villages in Greece. So where does that idea come from?
So it's that same issue that I had about having such a good and strong connection to these folk traditions just for a few days out of the week, or in the summers when we were spending time in Greece. And then I would end up shopping at, a Zara or, a store like that. And I would be buying just whatever clothes that didn't really have my identity. And I just thought it was such a shame because we have such rich traditions and I wasn't taking advantage of them. So that's how those came together. And for years, I've been kind of adding things to my own clothes. I would find embroidery pieces and I would sew them onto existing clothes that I had, like shirts, things like that, in skirts. And then a couple of years ago, I kind of was just talking with my husband about, wouldn't this be great if this was a thing? If I would walk down the street in Thessaloniki and see women wearing something that looked like, a traditional Macedonian dress. And then he was like, yeah, why don't you do this? And so just from this conversation that we had so many years ago, I ended up just pulling the trigger and I went for it. So the idea is to, because while there are a number of companies in Greece, luckily, that have started to take a turn towards more of like a Greek, a traditional approach. And we saw that especially this year with Dior doing their show in Athens. I'm sure you've seen it too. They actually used local artisans, one from my area of Argos too. So there's this turn that they're taking, but what I saw as like a gap was that there wasn't a distinction, that any kind of adoption of Greek traditions was kind of broadened. So it was kind of like broadly Greek folk, or a Greek folk touch to these clothes, but there wasn't any specific identity. And the great part about Greek traditions is that everything is so unique that things change from village to village, even linguistically, the way they dance, the songs they sing, and especially the way they dress. And even within a village, I remember speaking with women, they would say, oh, I could tell who so-and-so was just from the back of her dress. The embroidery was so different. So I wanted to highlight that. And I think that it's such like it's so unique to Greece to have this hyper differentiation, that I thought that this would be a good idea to do each season, just focus on one village or one region, depending, and really highlight this cultural variation that we have within Greek borders.
So Vicky, I want to go back to how you're balancing being a historian, but also being a fashion designer. So fashion wasn't always necessarily in the cards for you.
No, not at all. I kind of touched on it briefly, but yeah. I just took sewing as a practical trade that I wanted to learn, just kind of know the basics to know how to use a machine. And then for my own and my family, if they needed pants tailored, things like that, I would have my machine and I would sew it for them. So it was never anything professional. And anybody who sees my sewing work could never say that it's professional. It's definitely, it needs some work. But luckily, Greece is full of really great, skilled technicians. And I have like a really wonderful team, a young woman my age who cuts the patterns. And we have great communication. And there's a mother-daughter team in Thessaloniki who sews. And then the local factories that produce the fabric to my specifications. It's a really great place to be for this.
So can you take us through your last collection?
Yeah, so I wanted to have the first collection be Anoia Crete, because it's a really special area. The island is incredibly special. And I remember when I was I must have been 17 or 18, I went to this bagpipe festival in a village outside of Iraklio. It's the Askomadura festival. And I just couldn't believe it, because I'd spent so much time in different regions of Greece, and it's usually older people, the older generation were the ones that were really taking control and dancing and playing music and things like that. But then when I went to this village, it was all young people like 18 to 30 playing the bagpipe, dancing. You wouldn't see an older person on the dance floor. And so it was really just inspired by how much the younger generation really lives their folk. They still speak, they have a very nice dialect. The men come out in their boots and in their pants, wearing black. So there was a really good connection to the next generation. And so I was really inspired by that. And I'd always wanted to, if, this were to materialize, want to really make a tribute to that connection to the next generation, that it's not dying with, these 90-year-olds in a village, that the younger generation is very much taking it on and making it their own and continuing it. So I wanted that to be reflected in the first season of Palaiologue.
Yeah, and I love that. And I love how when people can use their own gifts to keep traditions alive and pass it on to the next generation as well. So that's why what you're doing also is really important in terms of that as well. But I'd like to know, what's been the most rewarding part for you since starting your company?
I think with all projects, I think just seeing it come to completion, that's always a really great joy to actually know that from an idea, you've materialized it. That's been exciting. I saw a woman on the street wearing one of my dresses, and that was incredible. That was an amazing feeling. And just having this first step so I can continue to come up with ideas. And I think that's also really just, it's a nice feeling to know that you can build on something and make it bigger. And then hearing feedback from other people about what they would like to see too. It's nice to be able to collaborate and to see ideas materialize.
I'd like to go back a little bit to something you said before, because I know you said you learned how to loom. I'd love to know more about that experience, because for me that sounds so interesting, but also a bit of a lost art, maybe, in my point of view.
Yeah, luckily there's a number of companies in Greece that have been taking it up again. There's actually a company called Argalios, and they come up with these really gorgeous clutch purses that are made on a loom. And that's not the only company. There are a number of them in Greece that have adopted it. And so it's fantastic because there's this, like we talked about a little bit earlier, a folk revival. So it's really incredible. But I learned a few years ago, must have been 2016 or 17, I can't remember exactly, but I'd gone up to a village in Thrace, and I was just casually talking to the women about what it was like to grow up, what was making your prika like, your dowry, and just questions like that, what it was like to be a young woman. And they would say, like, we would be out in the fields all day, we would come home, start preparing food, things like that, and then at night, we would be working until we would fall asleep, by candlelight, by lamplight, working, embroidering our dowry. And then we would be looming fabric. So that answer led to, does anybody still have a loom? And one woman said she did. So she took me into her basement. And then from there, she just showed me how to first thread the loom, which is incredibly complicated. It was like doing a math problem to figure out how everything gets set up. And that's just how it started. Yeah. I wish I had the space in my house to have a loom, because it would be incredible to be able to continue this. Really, there were cursory lessons, but I was in love. I mean, even the sound of it is just very magical to just do this and hear the back and forth of that.
Yeah. I love how it's really a tactile experience. And I love also a bit of what it represents as well, because there's a lot of strength, I think, in the generation that you're talking about. And I think it shows through your clothing as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
So what's next for Palaiologue?
So it's a really hard question, because every village I go to, I always say, okay, this is going to be next season. I was in Hioureas, I must have been 2 years ago, and they have so many different variations of dress where I just didn't know where to start. So it's a really tough one, because everything is just, everything is so beautiful. And then of course I have friends saying, oh, can you do my village next? But yeah, soon the summer collection will be produced, and we'll see what comes out of it.
Nice. Well, I can't wait to see it. Vicky, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And make sure you head over to palaiologue.com to shop.